The rain lashed against the windows of the police station, its relentless rhythm echoing through the near-empty room. Officer Richard sat at his desk, methodically organizing the scattered papers in front of him. His neatly trimmed mustache twitched as he glanced out at the stormy night. Across the room, Officer Luke lounged in his chair, tossing a small rubber ball against the wall. The soft thud of the ball hitting the surface contrasted sharply with the howling wind outside. "This storm is relentless," Luke muttered, stretching lazily. "Think it'll let up before our shift ends?" Richard chuckled dryly, his voice steady, but carrying a hint of forewarning. "Storms like these always pause right before the real trouble begins. Consider it the calm before the bigger storm." Luke laughed, though unease laced his tone. "You're always so dramatic, Richard. Maybe it's just rain." The wind outside suddenly died down, leaving an eerie stillness. The abrupt silence felt unnatural, making both men pause and exchange uneasy glances. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder in the quiet. Then, piercing through the tranquil moment, the telephone rang. Its sharp, jarring sound made Luke flinch, the rubber ball slipping from his hand and rolling under the desk. Richard stood, his expression instantly serious, and reached for the receiver. "Police station, this is Officer Richard speaking," he said, his voice professional and calm. Luke straightened in his chair, his earlier nonchalance replaced by curiosity. At first, there was no response. Richard's brow furrowed as he listened closely, straining to catch even the faintest sound. Then it came. A shaky, hesitant breath on the other end. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "Hello? Who is this? Are you safe?" he asked, his tone softening but remaining firm. His mouth quivered. A small, trembling voice finally broke through. "My mom. She locked me in the bathroom again." Richard froze, his heart skipping a beat. The voice was that of a child, frail and filled with terror that was almost palpable. Luke leaned forward, his eyes wide with concern. "Finally." Richard frowned plainly. "Okay." Richard frowned plainly. "What's going on?" Luke whispered urgently. Richard held up a hand to silence him, his focus entirely on the child. "Stay calm," Richard said into the phone, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "Can you tell me your name? Where are you?" The child hesitated, a muffled sob escaping before answering. "It hurts. She does things that hurt me." Richard closed his eyes briefly, the weight of those words hitting him like a blow. He forced himself to remain composed. "Listen to me," he said gently. "I'm here to help you. I need you to tell me where you are so we can come get you. Can you do that for me?" A silence followed, filled only with the sound of the child's shaky breathing. Richard's patience never wavered, though every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the child whispered, "I'm in the bathroom." "It'll be like lightning in there," Jack whispered. Richard's lips went round the words, Richard understood then that the boy was in immediate danger. "I promise, no one will know you called. I just need to know where you are to help you. Can you tell me your address?" Hellman repeated the brother's name. The man said, "Richard." Hellman repeated the brother's name. The man replied. Hellman repeated the brother's name. Before the child could respond, a noise interrupted the line. The sound of a door closing in the distance. Then a gasp. And then deep silence. "Don't hang up," Richard cried, his voice urgent. "We're here to help you." But it was useless. The dry sound of the amplified receiver echoed in his ears like a death knell. Luke rushed over, his expression tight with worry. "What did they say? What's going on?" he asked, his voice edged with urgency. Richard, still gripping the phone, slowly placed it back on the cradle. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "It was a kid. Sounded terrified," he said. "His mom locks him up and hurts him. No name, no address, just begged for help, and then hung up." Luke blinked, struggling to process the weight of those words. "A kid?" How are we supposed to find him? We've got nothing to go on. Richard's jaw tightened as he met his partner's gaze. I don't know yet, he admitted, his voice low but resolute. But we can't just sit here. That child called us because he believed we could help. And we will. Whatever it takes. His determination was unmistakable, though Luke's eyes reflected a mix of fear and doubt. So, what now? Luke asked, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. This was 3 days ago, Harris said. Richard exhaled sharply, as if trying to steady himself under the crushing weight of responsibility. We start looking. We don't stop until we find him. The room grew silent. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the steady ticking of the clock amplifying the tension. Both men knew that this night, which had started out so uneventful, was about to spiral into something far more intense than they had bargained for. And though neither spoke it aloud, the same haunting question lingered in the air. What kind of nightmare was that child living through? The small, dimly lit bathroom was filled with tension as the boy's fragmented cries echoed off the tiled walls. His words were barely audible, but their meaning was unmistakable, a desperate plea for help. Richard and Luke, frozen momentarily by the heart-wrenching scene, quickly regained their composure. Richard stepped forward, his voice authoritative as he directed his command toward the figure by the tub. "Step away from the child now," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The woman beside the tub, presumably the boy's mother, startled at the sound of his voice. Her face was streaked with tears and sweat, her hands trembling as they hovered over the child. Richard approached her with steady hands, gripping her arms gently but firmly, guiding her to a corner of the cramped bathroom. She sobbed uncontrollably, her body shaking with each gasp for air. "It's not what it looks like. Please, you have to believe me," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she raised her hands defensively, as though shielding herself from unseen accusations. Luke's stance was firm, his tone measured but unyielding. "Ma'am, you've got a lot of explaining to do," he said, narrowing his eyes. "This doesn't look right. Step away from the child, now." The woman shook her head frantically, her voice a desperate, jumbled whisper. "You don't understand. I was only trying to help him. Please, just listen." Her voice escalated into a wail, the sound raw and strained, clawing for sympathy. Richard, still holding the small boy in his arms, felt the child's tremors ripple through his own body. The boy's muffled cries, full of fear and pain, burrowed deep into Richard's chest. He locked eyes with Luke, his face etched with concern. "This isn't normal," Richard murmured, his voice heavy with unease. "There's something going on here that we don't fully grasp yet." Luke nodded slightly but kept his focus on the sobbing woman, who clutched at the air as though the words she struggled to form could bridge the growing gap between her and the officers. The tension in the room was suffocating, the very air thickened by the weight of what had transpired. No one could say for certain what had unfolded, but it was clear that this moment, with its desperate cries and heavy silences, would leave a permanent mark on everyone involved. The woman's shoulders slumped as she lifted her tear-streaked face to meet Richard's steady gaze. Her exhaustion was palpable, but some deep instinct compelled her to speak, to defend herself against their judgment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, quivering under the strain of her emotions. "It's not what you think. Please, hear me out," she began, her eyes darting from Richard, who held the boy with cautious tenderness, to Luke, whose stoic expression carried just a flicker of compassion. Luke inclined his head slightly. "Start from the beginning," he said, his voice even. "Help us understand, because what we just saw doesn't look good." She drew in a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she pressed them together. The words spilled out, chaotic and urgent, driven by desperation. "My son," she said, her voice faltering. "He has a severe skin condition, atopic dermatitis. His skin flares up, gets covered in rashes, and itches so badly that he scratches until he bleeds. I can't—" Her voice broke. "I can't let that happen." Luke folded his arms and took a step closer, his skepticism plain. And that's why he was screaming like that? Ma'am, that boy was in pain. You think that's okay? It's not okay. I know it's not okay, she cried, her voice rising as fresh tears streamed down her face. But what else can I do? Warm water soothes his skin. It's the only thing that helps, even if it stings at first. If I don't, the rashes spread, and it gets worse. Richard glanced down at the boy in his arms. The child's small body was limp, his breath hitching as he tried to calm down. Red, inflamed patches marred his skin, as if his body had been waging a relentless war against itself. Richard's heart clenched. Whatever the woman's methods, the boy's suffering was undeniable, and so was her anguish. Then why haven't you taken him to a hospital if it's this serious? Richard asked, his voice low but firm. This isn't something you should handle alone. Her head dropped, her hands flying to her face, as though she could shield herself from the question. I've taken him. Of course I have, she said, her voice muffled by her hands. But every time the doctors tell me the same thing. Expensive treatments, specialist visits. I can't afford any of it. I'm doing the best I can with what little I have. The warm baths are all that works, even if it hurts him at first. Luke exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples, his frustration mixed with confusion as he glanced at Richard. You think this is enough? You think putting him through this every night is okay? He was screaming, "Ma'am." It didn't sound like you were helping him. It sounded like you were hurting him. It sounded like you were hurting him. You virtue sagging. Her sobs grew louder, her voice breaking under the strain. I know. Don't you think I know? Every scream, every tear breaks me apart. But if I don't do it, he suffers more. You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to watch your child claw at himself until he bleeds, to see him burn with fever because his skin is infected. I'm doing the best I can, and the words crumbled into a barely audible whisper, heavy with despair. Richard looked at Luke, his expression a mix of concern and resolve. This isn't a simple case, he said quietly. This doesn't feel like abuse, but something's not right here. We can't just walk away from this. Luke nodded slowly, his jaw tight. We'll figure it out, he said, though his tone remained guarded. For now, all they could do was stand amidst a storm of emotions that filled the small bathroom, piecing together the fragments of a story that was anything but ordinary. What do we do now, Richard? We can't just leave things as they are and walk away like nothing happened, Luke said, his voice tense, his gaze fixed on the sobbing woman leaning against the wall. Richard drew a deep breath, holding the boy closer to his chest, as if shielding him from the world. I don't know yet, he admitted, his tone heavy with responsibility. But what's clear is this child needs help. We can't let this go on. Sloan, Luke glanced at the woman, his face softening just slightly. We'll call Child Protective Services. They'll know what to do next. The woman's sobs quieted for a moment as her eyes widened in fear. No, please. They'll take him away. He's all I have. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't take him from me. Richard sighed, his voice gentle but resolute. Ma'am, we're not here to break your family apart. We're here to make sure this boy gets the care he needs. If you're willing to work with us, we'll do everything we can to keep him safe and with you. The woman nodded slowly, her tears still flowing, but her gaze steady. I'll do whatever it takes, she whispered. With the decision made, Richard and Luke set the wheels in motion, knowing this was only the beginning of a long and complicated journey for everyone involved. As they left the small bathroom, the boys' quiet sniffles still echoing in their ears, they resolved to uncover the truth and ensure the safety of the child at the center of it all.